The corridor at SEAL Training Detachment, Bravo hummed with familiar sounds. Heavy boots pounded the floor in rhythmic waves. Metal lockers clanged shut and the sharp smell of gun oil drifted from the equipment cages at the end of the hall. Norah Lane entered the hallway with quiet confidence, clutching a stack of briefing papers she'd checked 3 times before leaving her office. She dressed simply in a neutral cardigan over a plain navy shirt. Nothing about her screamed for attention, yet people noticed her anyway. 2 SEAL candidates elbowed each other as she walked by, their whispers just loud enough to reach her ears. One called her the paperwork girl. Another joked about the library running out of bookmarks. Their laughter started soft, then grew sharper when she turned toward the briefing hall. A lieutenant leaned against the doorway, arms folded, clearly amused. He lifted his chin and asked if she'd come to organize their gear racks alphabetically for inspection. The candidates behind him chuckled as if he'd told the funniest joke they'd ever heard. Norah didn't react. She simply gave a polite nod, held her documents closer, and walked past them with the same quiet dignity she always showed. She didn't argue, didn't respond, didn't give them anything to grab onto. Her silence unsettled them far more than any comeback would have. The briefing room door shut behind her, but the uncomfortable feeling hung in the air like smoke. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button for military and veteran stories so you don't miss these real tales of bravery, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from today. Norah Lane had recently turned 32, but she carried herself with the calm steadiness of someone much older. At SEAL Training Detachment Bravo, people knew her simply as the administrative librarian, the woman who organized the archives, historical mission files, training guides, and the countless pages that instructors depended on daily. Her office sat tucked between the operations wing and the old storage area, a spot most people walked past without a second glance. But she gets everything. She always had. Her movements were careful, almost graceful. She handled papers the way others handled weapons, with care, purpose, and no wasted energy. When she spoke, her voice came out soft and measured, never demanding attention, yet impossible to mistake for uncertainty. Her eyes held that same calm focus, whether she was filing a new mission report or helping an instructor find missing navigation chart. Yet those same eyes made many people underestimate her. They saw gentleness where they expected toughness. They saw quiet where they expected sharpness. They saw a bookish woman with neatly tied hair and assumed she belonged somewhere safer, quieter, easier. Every morning she arrived before the first training bell rang. The sun barely touched the horizon when she unlocked the library, switched on the warm overhead lights, and started organizing the stacks of training briefs the night crew had left behind. She made small pencil notes that instructors trusted more than they'd admit. She updated maps, fixed mislabeled files, and repaired pages torn during long field nights. She worked in silence, comfortable with the rhythm of paper and the soft hum of the air system. But outside that peaceful space, the world treated her differently. Candidates walked past her without slowing, wearing their confidence like armor. Some gave polite nods, but most didn't bother. They saw her as an outsider, someone without the mud, sweat, and scars they believed defined belonging. When she brought files to the classrooms, conversations quieted just enough to suggest she'd interrupted something important. When she left, the doors closed with a little more force than needed. One petty officer, older and stuck between ranks, once said loud enough for her to hear that she had the safest job on base. He said it with a grin and a tone thick with barely hidden envy. Norah simply handed him the file he'd requested, nodded, and walked away. Another time, a trainee rushing down the hallway bumped her shoulder hard enough to knock her papers out of order. He didn't stop, he didn't say sorry, he just kept moving as if she were another piece of furniture in his way. And still, Norah stayed steady. Her daily work continued without complaint. She prepared historical binders for new recruits, making sure every detail matched the official record. She helped the instructors with logistics for Memorial Days, placing small flags and plaques with a reverence that came from somewhere deep inside her. She spoke gently to rookies who wandered into the library confused or nervous, guiding them through manuals or offering quiet encouragement. At lunch, she sat alone, not because she wasn't welcome. No one actively pushed her away, but the tables filled with loud stories of past drills, bruises, and personal rivalries. She didn't mind the solitude. She used the time to read through old handwritten mission accounts, the ones preserved from decades earlier. She handled those pages with the same tenderness others reserved for family photographs. There were small things about Norah that didn't fit her civilian job title, though most never noticed. Her posture was too precise, too straight, the kind drilled into someone long before they ever worked behind a desk. When she walked into a room, her eyes automatically checked exits and blind corners, not from fear but from habit. During veteran visitation days, she never stepped forward to greet anyone she clearly recognized. Instead, she stayed behind the display shelves, watching quietly, with a complicated expression, part respect, part distance. Now and then someone caught these details. A young maintenance worker once paused when she corrected him on a technical term in an old field manual. Her explanation was too sharp, too experienced for someone who supposedly lived behind a desk. He left with a puzzled expression that stayed with him long after he walked away. But questions never lasted long at Detachment Bravo. The next drill, next briefing, next exhausting test pulled attention away from the quiet librarian. She moved through her days without resentment, without bitterness, only a steady patience that felt out of place among recruits, fueled by energy and ambition. She didn't fight for visibility. She didn't argue when dismissed. She didn't defend herself against the small jabs that came with ignorance. She walked past all of it with the unshakable calm of someone who had already faced things much heavier than careless words. Most saw a woman who didn't belong in a world built from steel and sweat, but the truth ran deeper, much deeper. By the time she finished her shift each evening, the sun dipped low across the base, casting long shadows over the training ground. Norah always paused at the memorial wall before heading out. She brushed dust from the edges, straightened a wreath, or set a fallen ribbon back in place. No one watched her do it. No one knew why she cared so much. One day, as she left the logistics office with a stack of folders pressed to her chest, a candidate bumped her again, this time hard enough to make her take a half step back. He didn't look at her, didn't say a word. Her papers nearly slipped. She caught them with quiet precision, steadying herself with the same calm breath she used every day. For a brief moment, her eyes lowered not in defeat, but in thought. A flicker of something deeper passed across her face, a shadow of memories no one else could see. The hall buzzed around her with shouts and laughter, unaware of the weight she carried alone. And as she walked on, that weight followed her, silent, steady, waiting to be revealed. The audience feels it too, even if the people around her don't yet see it. Something about Norah Lane is different, something they've overlooked, something waiting beneath the quiet. The afternoon briefing always carried a different energy from the morning session. The hall filled slowly at first, then all at once with candidates shaking off sweat from the obstacle course, and instructors flipping through their lesson notes. Norah arrived early as she always did, placing a stack of clean, crisp briefing packets at each seat, around the long table. She moved with quiet precision, smoothing edges, straightening pens, making sure every candidate had what they needed before the session began. When the room settled, she stepped to the front with the remaining folders tucked neatly under her arm. Captain Rhodes stood near the projector, preparing to walk the candidates through their next set of navigation drills. Norah waited for his nod before handing out the final packets. It was a simple routine, one she carried out but the mood in the room shifted the moment she stepped forward. A few candidates exchanged glances, one made an exaggerated whisper, another leaned back in his chair with an amused smirk. As Norah placed a packet in front of a young candidate named she caught a small error on the printed map, an incorrect grid coordinate that could throw off the entire drill if left uncorrected. She quietly fixed the number with a fine pen, making sure the notation matched the official data. Briggs noticed and laughed under his breath. "There it is," he said to his buddy. "A typo from the library lady." The comment sparked a wave of low chuckles across the table. Someone in the back added something about keeping storybooks and manuals separate next time. Norah didn't rise to it. She simply handed out the last packet, adjusting her glasses with calm patience. Captain Rhodes heard the laughter. He didn't join in, but he also didn't shut it down. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably, cleared his throat, and continued setting up the projector. His silence said enough. He was embarrassed, but not enough to step in. Norah moved to stand near the side wall, ready to leave quietly once Rhodes began the presentation. But as she scanned the materials one last time, her eyes paused on a scheduling column. The Bravo unit's timed navigation drill had been listed incorrectly, set 30 minutes apart from its intended synchronized drill with Alpha Team. The mistake wasn't huge, but it was enough to throw off coordination and delay the entire cycle. She stepped closer to Rhodes and spoke in a low tone. "Sir, Bravo's timed drill appears mistyped here. It should follow Alpha's by 10 minutes, not 30. Rhodes blinked at the sheet, then back at her, uncomfortable as though her correction challenged his authority. Before he could respond, another candidate over. "She probably uses bookmark tabs to plan missions," he said loud enough to earn snickers. Someone else added, "Bet she never left a desk in her life." Norah didn't change expression. She pointed calmly at the data, traced it to the original schedule sheet she carried, and offered it to Rhodes for verification. The captain skimmed the information, realizing she was right, but instead of acknowledging it openly, he gave a short nod. "I'll handle it," he said, clearing his throat again. The candidates took his hesitation as permission. "Of course she caught it," one whispered dramatically. "Bookshelf instincts." A few laughed outright. Others looked down in awkward silence, unsure whether the mockery was deserved or too much. A couple of rookies glanced at Norah with unease, sensing something off about the tone in the room, but lacking the confidence to challenge it. Group dynamics shifted like weather, quick, unpredictable, and influenced by whoever spoke loudest. "What would you have done? Would you speak up or stay silent?" Norah stayed steady. She stepped back from the table, hands folded gently in front of her, and waited for Rhodes to begin. When he did, the briefing moved forward, but the undercurrent of laughter lingered. Midway through the session, another cluster of whispers rose behind her. "A librarian could never understand the field. She probably thinks topography is a chapter index. She's harmless." Norah heard every word. Her expression didn't change. She continued reviewing the attendance sheet quietly, marking who had received materials and who still needed updated copies. Her posture stayed straight, her focus steady, as if none of it touched her. Rhodes wrapped up the session with instructions for the next day's drill. As he dismissed the class, Norah stepped forward to collect extra packets. One candidate nearly collided with her as he rushed out, mumbling something about being late for gear checks. Another brushed past her with no acknowledgement at all. Still, she remained composed. She left the room with measured steps, gathering the remaining documents against her chest. The door clicked softly behind her, but the echoes of mockery followed her into the hallway, drifting after her like dust in the afternoon light. Her boots tapped lightly against the concrete as she walked toward the training yard. Outside, wind swept across the open grounds, carrying sand across the pavement and bringing the faint scent of the ocean. The yard was loud with movement, instructors shouting commands, candidates dragging weighted sleds, and the metallic ring of equipment echoing through the air. Norah paused for a moment at the edge of the walkway. The wind tugged at her cardigan, pulling strands of her hair. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the breeze settle something inside her. The world around her moved fast and loud. The world inside her moved steady and quiet. And somewhere beneath all the noise, the rising tension pressed closer. Not because she was weak, but because everyone assumed she was. They didn't know the truth. Not yet. She stepped forward, heading toward the far side of the training yard, the sand swirling at her feet like a curtain waiting to lift. The next morning brought a softer light to the base, the kind that stretched long across the walkways and made the training yard look almost peaceful. Norah unlocked the library earlier than usual, letting the quiet settle before the day's rush began. She moved down the aisles with a cart of materials, breathing in the familiar scent of old paper and polished wood. It was her favorite time, the only hour when everything felt still. The first hint arrived before most of the candidates were awake. A Marine historian, Lieutenant Colonel Harris, stepped into the library with a respectful nod. He was older, gray at the temples, and known for giving blunt lectures about preserving operational history. Yet with Norah, his tone softened immediately. "Good morning, Miss Lane," he said, lowering his voice as if entering a chapel. Norah nodded back gently. "Good morning, sir. The new reconnaissance archives are on the center table." Harris glanced at her with a familiarity that didn't match her job description. He thanked her with a seriousness that made one of the incoming candidates blink in confusion. The lieutenant colonel didn't treat many people that way, and definitely not librarians. When Harris stepped away to review the documents, Norah resumed shelving, but the candidate lingered, pretending to check the display case near the door as he watched her with narrowed curiosity. His attention shifted to the old M40 rifle mounted inside the glass, a historical piece meant to inspire rookie. Norah paused beside him, noticing his awkward grip as he tried to copy the stance he'd seen in pictures. Without thinking, she offered a quiet correction. Your support hand should be further forward, right under the balance point. The candidate stiffened, startled. Right. She stepped closer, hands hovering but not touching, guiding him with calm clarity. Here, if you hold it like this, you'll reduce the sway in the sight line. He adjusted his grip, and the difference was immediate. His eyes widened with surprise. That's actually right, he said softly, more to himself than to her. Norah simply nodded, then returned to her shelving cart. The candidate stood frozen for a moment, replaying her instruction in his head. Something about her tone, firm, controlled, too natural for someone without field time, stayed with him as he walked out. A few minutes later, Norah pulled an old mission log from the bottom shelf of the archive section. The leather spine cracked faintly as she opened it. Her fingers traced names, dates, and scribbled notes from 10 years ago. Operations she knew far too well. But it wasn't the mission that stopped her. It was the call sign. Shadow 9. The faded ink curled across the page like a whisper from another life. Her hand hesitated for the briefest second, a shadow crossing her eyes. Then she closed the log gently, slid it back into its slot, and steadied her breathing. She didn't need to linger on old ghosts. As she lifted the next box onto a top shelf, her sleeve slipped back, revealing a thin scar beneath her wrist. It was the kind of mark that didn't come from paper cuts or shelving mishaps. It was too straight, too deliberate. The faint echo of a blade or shrapnel. A passing staff member glanced at it, eyebrows rising. You get that from all the filing you do? He joked lightly. Norah tugged her sleeve down with a quiet smile. Occupational hazard. The answer was vague, harmless, and completely unconvincing. Later in the morning, she briefed an instructor on updates to the underwater navigation manuals. She explained certain depth markers and tactical adjustments with a fluency that made him pause mid-sentence. Where'd you pick up that terminology? He asked, tilting his head. She handed him the corrected documents without breaking her calm. From more places than I can list. The instructor watched her for a moment, sensing the layers behind that answer, but not pressing further. Norah had a way of closing doors without appearing secretive. She gave nothing away, yet nothing she said ever felt like a lie. Outside, a group of candidates began a log carry drill. Their shouts echoed through the library windows. One voice rose sharply, a burst of distress or pain. Norah's head snapped toward the sound instantly, posture straight, eyes narrowed as if tracking the source. The instructor beside her noticed. You heard that before I did. Old habit, she said simply. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Her body language said more than her words ever could. The way she shifted her weight subtly toward the sound. The way her gaze analyzed the direction. The way her breath steadied, prepared. These were not the reactions of someone used only to quiet rooms and neat paper stacks. Suspense around her grew like a quiet storm, unnoticed by those too busy to look deeper. But the few who paid attention began to wonder. She moved with knowledge she shouldn't have. She saw details others missed. She reacted with a precision that didn't match her job title. Yet she never bragged, never hinted, never sought recognition. Everything she revealed came in accidental flickers, like light slipping through the cracks of a sealed door. By midday, whispers began to form among the observant few. Nothing concrete, nothing bold, just curiosity feathering the edges of their assumptions. Who exactly was Norah Lane? Why did a historian respect her like a peer and not a librarian? Why did she correct a rifle stance, like she'd done it 1,000 times? Why did she look at mission logs like she remembered them? Why did she turn toward danger before anyone else? The questions stayed unspoken, but they lingered. None of these moments revealed the truth yet. They only deepened the mystery. They only pulled the curtain a little high, and soon the entire detachment would see the piece everyone else had missed. The water survival drill was supposed to be routine that afternoon. The candidates had spent the morning practicing breath holds, gear drops, and basic rescue techniques under the sharp eyes of the instructor. The pool deck echoed with orders, splashes, and the heavy clatter of weighted vests being tossed onto metal benches. Sunlight filtered through the high windows, reflecting off the water in wavering sheets of blue. Norah arrived with a stack of updated manuals tucked under her arm, planning to drop them off before heading back to the library. She walked along the edge of the pool carefully, avoiding puddles, her quiet presence almost invisible against the noise of training. The instructors were distracted by a broken rope mechanism on the far side of the room. A pulley had snapped during a gear drop demonstration. Metal clanged as they tried to secure it, shouting instructions over the sound. With the instructors busy, the drill continued loose. Candidates took turns jumping in with full combat gear, swimming to the center, then performing a controlled release at depth. It was demanding even on calm days, but with the instructors focused elsewhere, the timing was off. One candidate, a lanky trainee named Morrison, hit the water wrong. His gear twisted around him as he plunged under. When he came back up, he wasn't breathing properly. His arms thrashed against the drag of the vest. His eyes were wide with panic. A second trainee shouted, "He's stuck," but his voice was drowned by the metal crash on the far side of the pool. Norah froze for half a heartbeat. Not from fear, her instinct simply calculated the situation with frightening speed. The instructors were still busy. The candidates stood in a tight cluster, unsure what to do without direct order. Morrison's head slipped under the surface again, and this time he didn't come back up immediately. Norah placed the manuals on the bench. Then she slipped off her shoes. Her movements were so smooth that no one processed what was happening until she stepped onto the pool ledge. Without hesitation, she dove. But she didn't dive like a librarian. She dove like someone who had done it under pressure, in worse conditions, in waters far less forgiving. Her body cut through the surface with perfect form, barely a splash behind her. The water closed over her as she streamlined toward Morrison, with powerful strokes. For a moment the loud hall felt strangely silent. A few candidates rushed to the edge, shouting her name, but she didn't hear them. She was already beneath Morrison, flipping him with practiced precision. Underwater she loosened one of the tangled straps with one hand while stabilizing his body with the other. Her movements were efficient, controlled, taught by necessity rather than training video. When she surfaced with him she kept his airway clear, one arm supporting his back as she pushed toward the wall using a clean tactical side stroke. The instructors finally turned, alerted by the sudden uproar. They froze mid-step as Norah reached the pool's edge. Several candidates leaned down to help lift Morrison out, their faces pale. Norah guided them calmly. Keep his head elevated. Breathe with him. Slow him down. Her voice was firm, steady, the tone of someone who had done this hundreds of times. Morrison coughed hard, water spilling from his mouth. He blinked, dazed, looking up at Norah in shock. You're the librarian," he whispered. Norah offered a faint smile. Everyone reads something different. When she stepped out of the pool, water cascading down her clothes, silence fell across the deck. Even the instructors, men who had seen combat rescues on deployments, stared at her as if trying to figure out what they just witnessed. She picked up her shoes calmly, as if she had merely picked up a fallen book from the floor. One candidate finally voiced what everyone was thinking. "Where did you learn that?" Norah squeezed the excess water from her sleeve with complete composure. "I read the manual sometimes," she said lightly. "You'd be surprised what sticks." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. The instructors exchanged glances. One of them, Chief Holt, grabbed his clipboard and scribbled something quickly. Another instructor muttered that her rescue form was cleaner than half the active duty staff. Even Morrison, still coughing, kept glancing at her with disbelief. As she walked back toward the bench to collect the manuals, a quiet shift followed her. The earlier mocking voices were gone. The candidates who had laughed the loudest now avoided her eyes. Others watched her with a mix of confusion and respect they didn't know how to express. Whispers began immediately. That wasn't beginner stuff. She moved like she knew the drill better than that grip she used. That was a tactical rescue carry. Who is she? Word traveled fast through the unit. By the time Norah finished drying her hands with a spare towel, 2 training officers had already stepped aside, murmuring in low voices while watching her closely. They weren't suspicious in a hostile way. It was something else. Something like recognition that had not fully formed yet. Norah slipped back into her shoes and gathered the manuals, now slightly damp around the edges. She nodded politely to the instructors, who were still speechless. Then she turned and walked quietly toward the exit. Her posture held no pride, no showmanship, no expectation of thanks. She simply moved with the same calm steadiness she carried every day, even though everything around her had changed. Behind her, the stunned silence lingered. The pool deck felt different now. Charged, uncertain, waiting for someone to explain the impossible. But Norah didn't explain anything. She walked out of the training hall with the same quiet grace she always had, and the mystery around her deepened with every step. The quarterly evaluations always brought a different energy to Detachment Bravo. Officers straightened their posture. Instructors sharpened their tone. Candidates rehearsed every detail they thought might come under scrutiny. And all of it centered around one man, SEAL Commander Marcus Keegan. He arrived just after noon, stepping out of the black SUV with an intensity that shifted the atmosphere around the training compound. His presence alone carried decades of operational history, missions whispered about but never fully recorded, decisions that shaped units, and a reputation for recognizing talent before anyone else did. His boots echoed with purpose as he crossed the courtyard toward the main building. Keegan reviewed the outdoor drills first, then spoke briefly with instructor. But when the time came to evaluate the archival procedures, he headed straight for the library, something he rarely did himself. Inside, Norah stood behind the counter, sorting newly returned documents into organized stacks. She wore her usual cardigan, her hair tied loosely at the back of her neck, a few strands falling near her cheek. The sunlight through the window framed her silhouette as she worked quietly, unaware of who had just entered. Keegan stepped through the doorway and stopped cold. His expression, firm and unreadable only seconds earlier, shifted in a way that made the 2 candidates behind him exchange confused glances. His breath caught, his shoulders lowered, and something like disbelief softened the severity in his eyes. "Lane," he said, barely above a whisper. "Is that you?" Norah froze, not out of fear but because she recognized the voice she hadn't heard in years. She lifted her gaze slowly. Their eyes met. Time hung between them, filled with memories neither had spoken aloud in a long time. She nodded once, respectful, quiet, certain. "Command." The 2 candidates at the doorway stared. No one had ever heard Keegan speak to anyone like that. He stepped closer, his authoritative stride replaced with measured reverence. The room seemed to shrink around him. Papers on the counter rustled as if reacting to the shift in gravity. A staff sergeant across the room paused mid-sentence. A petty officer cut off his joke halfway. The silence spread like ripples across still water. Keegan stopped in front of the counter, lowered his voice, and spoke a name long buried in classified files. Shadow 9. The air stilled. The room froze. One of the candidates inhaled sharply, recognizing the call sign, not from training manuals, but from whispered stories passed between units. Stories about a recon operative so skilled that her missions blurred the line between legend and truth. Shadow 9, the operator who vanished from public records after a final classified mission overseas. Some believed she retired quietly, others believed she hadn't survived. The truth had never been confirmed, until now. Norah held his gaze with calm humility. "It's been a long time, sir." Keegan nodded, emotion tightening his jaw. "Too long." Whispers erupted throughout the room, low and disbelieving. "Shadow 9, that's her?" She saved teams that never even saw her face. She was real. A candidate near the back whispered, almost trembling, "She's a legend." No one laughed now. No one smirked. No one looked at her the way they had yesterday. The revelation moved through the detachment like a shockwave. Quiet, heavy, undeniable. And in that silent moment, every mocking word they had ever spoken about the librarian dissolved into the air around them, replaced by something they had never given her before. Respect, deep and immediate. For a long moment, no one in the library moved. Commander Marcus Keegan stood there in front of the counter, his chest rising and falling with a weight no one else fully understood. Then in a slow and deliberate motion, he straightened his spine, shifted his boots together and brought his hand sharply to his brow. A full formal salute directed at Norah Lane. The sound of his palms striking the brim of his cover echoed louder than any shout on the training grounds. Conversations in nearby rooms stilled. Footsteps halted in the hall. The two candidates at the doorway froze entirely, eyes widening as the realization hit them like a physical force. Commander Keegan was saluting the librarian. Shock rippled across the entire detachment like a silent explosion. Men who had mocked her just hours earlier stood paralyzed, their faces draining from amusement to disbelief, then settling into something far more complicated: regret. Norah didn't return the salute immediately. She hesitated, uncomfortable with a gesture she believed belonged to others, not to her anymore. Keegan held his posture unwavering. After a moment she lifted her hand with quiet precision, acknowledging him with the same discipline she once lived by. When she lowered her hand, the room exhaled as if the building itself had been holding its breath. Keegan faced the crowd that had gathered, the authority returning to his voice, but tempered with something deeper: admiration. "Most of you don't know who stands in front of you," he began. "But you should." Candidates and staff leaned in, hanging on every word. "Norah Lane," he continued, "was one of the finest reconnaissance operatives we ever had. Her missions were classified, her movements were silent, her commitment was absolute." The silence thickened. Even the humming lights seemed to soften. She executed Overwatch in high-risk environments, where visibility meant death. She moved through territories most of you only study on a map, and she completed operations that protected teams who never even knew she was watching over them. Whispers trembled along the book aisles, full of awe rather than rumor. Keegan's voice lowered slightly as he added, "Her final mission left her wounded. She was discharged quietly, without the recognition she deserved, because the details were sealed. But those of us who knew her never forgot." Norah looked down as if the floor held something she needed to read. Her shoulders stayed straight, but a faint tension touched the corners of her eyes. She never wanted this moment. She never asked for it. And now that it was here, the attention felt heavier than any load she had carried in the field. One of the candidates who had laughed at her earlier, Briggs, took a cautious step forward. His voice was small, stripped of all arrogance. "Ma'am, why didn't you tell us?" Norah lifted her gaze slowly. She didn't scold. She didn't lecture. She didn't remind them of every whispered insult they'd thrown her way. Instead, her answer was simple, steady, and disarming. "Your training wasn't about me," she said. "It was about who you choose to become." Briggs lowered his head in shame. Others shifted uncomfortably, reminded of every careless comment, every smirk, every assumption. None of their jokes felt funny anymore. They felt like stains on their own sense of honor. Commander Keegan nodded approvingly at her response. "That's who she's always been," he said. "A quiet warrior, a shadow when needed, a shield when it counted." The emotional weight settled over the room like the slow fall of dust. This wasn't the dramatic reveal they were used to from movies or stories. It was something deeper, something carved into silence, humility and truth. Norah did not boast. She did not stand taller. She did not bask in their awe. She stood the same way she always had. Steady, unclaimed by ego. And that steadiness struck them harder than any revelation of rank or call sign ever could. For the first time, the candidates truly saw her. Not the librarian who filed their paperwork. Not the quiet woman who walked the hallways unnoticed. But the soldier who had lived a life of courage without ever demanding recognition for it. A quiet strength. A silent protector, the kind of warrior whose stories rarely get told because they never tell them themselves. And in that moment, every person in the room understood exactly why her call sign had once carried so much weight. Shadow 9. Not because she hid, but because she watched over others without needing to be seen. The next morning, the sun rose over Detachment Bravo the same way it always did. Soft gold settling over the walkways. The scent of seawater moving through the air, boots striking rhythm against the concrete. But inside the library, something had changed. Not in Norah Lane's routine. She arrived at her usual time, unlocked the door with the same careful turn of the key, and began straightening the shelves just as she always had. She hummed under her breath, arranged the returned manuals, and made notes for the instructors who would stop by later. Her world looked the same, but everyone else's view of her had shifted. The first sign came when a young candidate approached the library door and paused. Instead of slipping past her with hurried indifference, he held the door open. "Good morning, ma'am," he said quietly. His tone held a respect far deeper than politeness, something grounded in understanding. Norah offered a small nod of thanks, neither encouraging nor dismissing the gesture. She simply accepted it with quiet warmth. Inside, voices that once dropped into mocking whispers now lowered in reverence. Trainees walked more carefully between the shelves, as if the room itself deserved a different level of respect. Questions that used to be thrown at her with impatience were now asked with sincerity. "Ma'am, do you have the reconnaissance route logs from the older curriculum?" "Ms. Lane, could you explain the difference between these two Overwatch charts? Is this terrain description accurate for the cliffside exercises?" They didn't ask because they thought she had memorized the book. They asked because they finally understood she had lived much of what those books described. Norah answered each question with the same calm tone she always used. She didn't embellish. She didn't slip stories of her past into the conversation. She showed them how to read maps more efficiently. She pointed out which mission histories were worth their time. She corrected their understanding of old field techniques without ever referencing the experience behind her correction. At one point, a small group of trainees gathered around a table where she had spread out a set of coastal surveillance diagrams. Her fingers traced the lines with practiced familiarity. "This marker," she explained, "is misleading unless you understand the tide sequence here. Study it with that in mind." They listened like her words carried weight, because now they knew they did. By midday, instructors began stopping by, not just for paperwork but for her input. Chief Holt asked her to review the new rescue drill outline. Captain Rhodes asked if she thought the updated navigation schedules made sense. She didn't take authority over them. She simply offered quiet, focused observations that improved the training without drawing attention to herself. Norah remained who she always had been, steady, modest, and deliberate. But now the detachment walked slower through the library. They spoke softer. They looked at her with the kind of admiration people feel when they realize they misjudged someone who deserved far better. No one brought up her call sign again. No one asked for stories. No one tried to turn her into a legend. Instead, they treated her with the respect owed to someone who had served in silence. As the day drew toward evening, a reflection settled like dusk over the base. Courage does not always shout. It often whispers from the corners of ordinary places, carried by people who never ask to be seen. People who stand steady in the background, giving more than anyone realizes, until the moment the truth breaks through. Norah Lane was one of those people, and sometimes the strongest warriors are the ones who choose silence over praise. So as the sun set over Detachment Bravo, and the day's echoes softened into quiet, Norah Lane continued her work with the same steady hands that had once guided teams through danger from the shadow. Her story was never about recognition. It was about service. Quiet, humble, unseen. The kind of service carried by countless men and women who walk among us without ever mentioning what they've lived through or what they've given. If this story touched you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and take a moment to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories. These stories matter. They keep courage alive for the next generation, and they honor those who never ask for the spotlight, but deserve it all the same.